Yeah.
Looks like it. Yeah, we're on YouTube, it looks like. Yeah.
We are there?
Yeah,
Yep.
we are.
Oh, well, I'm not gonna.
Shall we take it away then? Hi,
All right.
everybody, and welcome to the Biotensegra Tea Party. I'm Chris Morita Clancy, and I am here with my co-hosts, Susan Lowell de Solorzano. Hi,
Hey
Susan.
there, coming to you from Washington, D.C.
And Graham Scarr.
Hello, I'm coming to you from sunny Nottingham in the UK.
The Biotensegrity Tea Party is a production of the Stephen M. Levin Biotensegrity Archive. And we're thrilled to be here with all of you for our first tea party of 2025. So today our topic is paper, Moving Beyond Vesalius, Why Anatomy Needs a Mapping Update. And that was written by Graham and Susan, and Leonid was the second author on that. Steve and Susan also, we're all working together on this paper. We're thrilled that it was cited in a recent paper, in a recent STECO paper. And today, Graham will be giving us a presentation. But before we do that, we want to open the tea party with a toast, like we always do. So, Anastasia.
Okay, so everybody raise your cups or various drinking implements, and here we are to toast into 2025. I'm thrilled to be here with Graham, Susan, everybody. Welcome to the tea party, Biointegrity Tea Party. Cheers.
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 Thanks, Anastasia. It's so great to see you here and everyone else. Before or as Graham is getting set up to give his presentation, I just want to let everyone here and all of our YouTube audience know that the Biotensegrity Archive is nonprofit. We bring biotensegrity to as many people as possible. And if you would like to give a donation, they're always greatly appreciated. The links are on our newsletter that comes out just before an archive meeting, before a tea party, excuse me. And I will find a link to sign up for the newsletter and put it also in the YouTube comments. Okay. So,
Yeah, I'm going to just mention also, we haven't been having biotensegrity parties as frequently these days, but we are having one next week as well. And we'll be focusing on uh, baseball pitching injuries. So if you're not already on the archive email list, go to biotensegrityarchive.org and join our email list if you want to be able to join us live on YouTube.
we've got some exciting guests coming for that one too, don't we, Susan?
We do. Gio Caraballo from the Mets and Paul Davis from the Atlanta Braves.
Okay, and let's get going then. Graham, are you ready?
Yes, I want to say a few words before I get into
Okay.
the slides first. Um, you've probably all heard somebody saying things like biotensegrity is a different way of thinking about the human body and the whole of biology. And this paper, Moving Beyond Vesalius, I can't forget the title myself now, Moving Beyond Vesalius.
Let me pop in. I've got it written down. Moving Beyond Vesalius, Why Anatomy Needs a Mapping Update.
Of course, yes. Thank you very much. It came out of a different way of thinking about the human body. And about 10 years ago, I was looking at the alignment of collagen fibers in the muscular fascia and how they influence muscle function. And I kept coming across these references to muscle compartments and fascial compartments, but they're just little isolated references, and there was no coherent explanation of what it was all about. So I started to think more about it and discovered that this idea of fascial compartments wasn't a new thing, but it was several hundred years old, and somehow it had got forgotten about. So then that inspired a new exploration to what this was all about, and hence the paper came out of that. So without any further ado, let's get to this slides. All right. So in 1944, Erwin Schrödinger posed the question, what is life? And examined it in relation to the scientific knowledge available to him at the time. And many others have asked the same question. In the process, Schrödinger suggested that we must be prepared to find a new type of physical law. But after 80 years, how much closer are we to answering that question? The improvement of the human condition is a driver behind a vast amount of ongoing research and naturally employs the most up-to-date methods in its endeavors. It has contributed greatly to our understanding of the human body and benefited our healthcare systems in remarkable ways. But there is a problem. Our understanding of life is essentially rooted in mechanistic thinking from the 17th century and allowed many simplifying assumptions to persist to the present day. The accumulation of knowledge has thus been a gradual and rather tortuous process based on tradition and historical precedent, and made great steps forwards. But that knowledge has often been catalogued in a rather arbitrary way. Anatomists have a tradition of naming structures after the person who first described them, but which seem to have little in common with each other. So we can probably guess what some of these things might be, but the labels in themselves are not really that helpful. And when it comes to the naming of muscles, we have several different classifications, such as the number of muscle heads, their fiber orientations, or their presumed functions. And even the word muscle has a strange origin in the Latin word for little mice. So there is clearly a lack of consistency in the labeling of all these different structures. And it gets even more crazy when we look at the bones. The atlas bone is named as such because it supports the head. Quite reasonable. But the tibial bone in the legs, because they were used to make early flute-like instruments. The calcaneum in the foot, because it resembles a piece of chalk. The bones of the wrist and ankle, because of their peculiar geometries. And the pelvic bones that have no name, and so are collectively referred to as the innominates. In addition, most medical terms have their origins in a variety of different languages. And as there is no unified system of classification, all these structures have become what is essentially a jumbled collection of anatomical bits, like stamp collecting, or like an anatomical zoo, with specimens that have been acquired over hundreds of years and are now established in the textbooks, and thus form the basis for modern research. The piecemeal acquisition of scientific knowledge has thus been a rather haphazard process, filtered through thousands of years of political, religious, and cultural influences. It is built on tradition and brought us to where we are now. But a fundamental problem remains. We tend to think of muscles, bones, and organs as the most important structures, and everything else as secondary, which is why we talk about these different systems as if they are separate things. Living organisms are fundamentally indeterminate and exist in states that are far from equilibrium, which means that we can never know everything about them because they are so hugely complex. Yet a detailed appreciation of anatomy is essential to a proper understanding of normal and abnormal physiology. The term anatomy has been defined as the bodily structure of an organism, the reality or state of things that actually exists, but also a study of the structural dynamics of something. In other words, it describes both the stuff that is contained inside us and the abstract portrayal of that reality through all its different structural and functional characterizations. And it should be noted that the two are not equivalent. In fact, they are very different. Because no matter how useful or lifelike they may be, descriptive texts, images, models, and analysis are just mapping the territory. They are simplified representations of reality in the same way that a geographical map isolates a particular region and summarizes key places, topography, and relationships within it. So valuable they may be. Such mapping interpretations always contain subjective biases and distortions that are limited by the scale at which they're presented, thus prompting the development of new maps, charts, and models to pick up the details previously omitted. And as Monnier put it, to avoid hiding critical information in a fog of detail, the geographic map must offer a selective, incomplete view of reality, and anatomy is bound by the same cartographic paradox. As a prominent anatomist in the 16th century, Andreas Vesalius published a groundbreaking book that overturned many of the erroneous ideas that had dominated since the time of Galen, some 1400 years previously. And apart from the drawings of Leonardo da Vinci that remained largely hidden until the 19th century, the clarity and detail of Vesalius' illustrations surpassed all others and significantly advanced human knowledge. They also enabled the gruesome reality of the detection table to be pondered by those of a more genteel disposition, with the drawings of muscles and bones presenting a simplified mapping of anatomy that persists to the present day. But we must not forget the elephant in the room, the things that are pushed aside and we don't talk about. The assignment of bones to the role of rigid framework or skeleton then naturally followed from observations of their stiffness and apparent stability, and it was inevitable that comparisons with man-made constructions would be made. And as movement is the means that we use to express life, muscles became firmly embedded with the bones in a musculoskeletal duality as the basic structural framework of the body, which then conveniently fitted with the mechanistic theories of nature promulgated by René Descartes, Isaac Newton, and Giovanni Borelli, who described the body as a system of levers, pulleys, and other contrivances that are now part of mainstream thinking. So the human body is now widely considered to function like a machine with fixed interacting parts, a system of gravity-dependent columns, beams, and levers, and soft tissues that move them around like the rigging in a sailing ship. In other words, a simplified musculoskeletal duality which has relegated the fascial connective tissues to mere packing tissue or ancillary roles. And there is another problem. Traditional musculoskeletal analysis has tended to focus on steady-state forces and kinematics and paid much less attention to its transients. But the transient properties of force generation are immensely important, and possibly more so than the steady-state properties. But until recently, the rate of change of force over time had no standard term in physics and thus received relatively little consideration. As a result, the dynamics of force transients have been simplified through the same analytic methods and formalisms as used in engineering. Here, the concepts of force, velocity, momentum, torque, and acceleration are typically processed through first and second order differential equations without the need to account for their higher order derivatives. But the assumption that this approximation is also valid for living tissues is not necessarily the case. In fact, the opposite is more likely because of the vulnerability of the system to the effects of these rapidly developing transients. So to put it in another way, a force impact is not an instantaneous event, but a transient one, a derivative of momentum that rapidly escalates but takes time to reach its peak. The next transient after acceleration, the third derivative of position over time, is jerk, and followed by the higher level transients, snap and crackle, etc. The first derivative of force over time is now referred to as yank, and is highly significant because it is proportional to jerk. An unexpected force impact that generates transient peak stress concentrations before the system has had time to react carries potential for injury at relatively low speeds and forces. So some of this might seem a bit confusing. I'm going to give you an example which may not strictly apply. Imagine yourself sitting on a train that's in the station. And in a few moments' time, it's going to go from 0 miles per hour to 100 miles per hour. And it does that, it gets there by accelerating. But the very first moment is a jolt, a jerk, as a train starts off. Think of these transient force transients in a similar way. When a force hits, impacts a structure, you get this quick jerk, which is proportional to yank, which can cause all sorts of problems. So the effects of these mechanical transients on the tissues, coupled with the long healing times required for post-traumatic recovery, then suggest that such peak loadings can quickly lead to material fatigue and destructive tissue failure. So orthodox biomechanical thinking may have worked wonders in improving the human condition, but its explanations of the biology itself are open to question. However, a key feature of the fascial system is its continuity at every level within the body, as can be seen in this cross-section of the thigh, where individual muscle cells are close packed within the myofascial tissues, the endomysium, perimysium, and epimysium, and groups of muscles are contained within the deep investing and superficial fascia at a higher size scale, with blood vessels and nerves running within them. In other words, a system of tubes within tubes within tubes, like the stacking of Russian dolls. So from the whole body architectural perspective, the fascia is a highly complex tissue that contains, connects, and encloses multiple subsystems within the cranium, thorax, abdomen, and limbs. Or in other words, a body-wide system of space-enclosing compartments with volume. Inside these high-level compartments are smaller fascial compartments, such as the pericardium, that encapsulates the heart, the parietal pleura that surrounds the lungs, the hepatic capsule that encloses the liver, the periosteum that covers the bones, and epimysium and deep fascia that surround and enclose the tubular muscles, while even smaller compartments enclose local specializations within them. And even the blood vessels, nerve bundles, the respiratory airways, intestines, and ureters are essentially tubular fascial compartments that contribute to the stability of the whole, with everything close packed into the most energy efficient configuration. Each compartment contains smaller compartments that contribute to the whole body architecture, with a soft fascial framework encompassing a complex heterarchy of tension fibrous tissues and compressed compartments that extends down to the microscopic level and supports itself. A key role of the fascial system is thus in facilitating the function of the parenchymal cells within their specialized compartments. The muscle cells, heart cells, liver cells, and epithelial cells, etc., all of which fits with traditional descriptions of the fascia as packing tissue, but is now highlighted for its space-filling contribution to architectural anatomy. Each fascial compartment thus carries a dual identity: the familiar functional identity provided by the parenchymal cells, but also a structural identity, which is provided by the tension fibrous tissues and their compressed contents. Or in other words, an intrinsically stable duality of tension and compression that is implicit in living systems at every level, hence tensegrity. And such a description then means that from an embryological, anatomical, and logical perspective, bones must now also be considered as compartmental specializations of the fascial system, because they have their origins in the same embryonic tissues. The fibrous material within bone may be mineralized and stiffened, but its complex internal organization also contains, supports, and facilitates the functions of the parenchymal cells within. The osteoblasts, osteoclasts, osteocytes, and marrow cells. And I'm now using the term parenchyma in its broadest functional sense. Thus, instead of the hardness and strength of bone being used to justify its role within a musculoskeletal framework, the usual interpretation, from a biotensegrity perspective, bones can now be considered as compartmental specializations that contribute to the dynamics of fascial architecture through their soft periosteal membranes and connected tendons, ligaments, and fascial sheaths. And this concept of fascial compartments is not something new, but a revival of a 17th century concept. Robert Hooke introduced the concept of the plant cell as a small compartment within a larger structure, while Marcello Malpighi observed similar compartments within animals and collectively referred to them as cellular tissue. The terms cell and cellular tissue thus had quite different meanings then than they do today, because they referred to the fibrous connective tissues and the compartmental spaces they enclosed, and which soon became firmly established in the anatomy textbooks. Indeed, so much so that Jean-Baptiste Lamarck declared that cellular tissue is the universal matrix of all organization, and that without this, no living body could exist. But the contents of those compartments were poorly understood at the time. And it was only later, when development in microscopy revealed the smaller nucleated parenchymal cells, the heart cells, liver cells, and epithelial cells, etc., within those compartments, that everything changed. Schwann's nucleated cell theory now gave those mysterious cellular compartments specific functions for the first time, and opened the way for their respective organs to assume functional dominance, which is why we now talk about the musculoskeletal system, vascular system, etc., as if they're just parts of the anatomical zoo. But at the same time, the original meaning of the term cell and cellular tissue gradually faded away, apart from its pathological significance. And the compartment aspect of fascial tissue anatomy was largely forgotten. So, don't know where this slide came from. Oh, yes, here we go. So this revival of a 17th century concept now considers the fascial system as an integrated, globally tensioned fibrous network that encompasses a complex heterarchy of compartments under compression and forms the architectural framework of the body, with each compartment having its own physical and parenchymal characteristics that contribute to the functional whole. Muscles and bones are then just compartmental specializations of the fascial system, and still very important, but the exclusivity implied in the term musculoskeletal is no longer tenable and effectively renders it obsolete. With the fascial system now considered as the primary controller of motion that acts in synergy with the nervous system. Shin offers a new definition of the fascial system. The fascial system is a multi-scale architectural framework consisting of tension fibrous network encompassing a complex heterarchy of specialized compartments under compression, each of which had its own physical and parenchymal cell-driven characteristics that contribute to the functional whole. So there's a brief summary of this paper, and we can get to having a chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. Great presentation, wonderful paper. I really appreciate you ending with the new definition. Now, at this point, I would like to invite people to put their hand up and join in the conversation if you've got questions, comments. And is Leonid still here? Leonid was our second author on the paper.
Yes, Leonid's here.
Okay. Leonid, did you want to fill in a little tiny bit of space before people start asking questions? Anything you'd like to add to this?
Graham put
I
it very
think you,
well.
oh no, I hear you now.
Yeah, you can hear me now. No, I think Graham put it very well. So, obviously, in this entire paper, the mathematical part is the one that comes from me, right? So, and I think that that's, well, probably the one that I wanted to, elaborate at. And although Graham did a great job kind of finding all the little references that exist to the, see, the paradox is actually these terms beyond jerk, like snap, crackle, and pop, it belongs to the department of physicists doing the jokes, So it just, it's one of those things which are really remarkable if you think about it, is that that everybody believes that things end with a force, but nobody really wants to get beyond that and try to understand, like, it's not just the force, what the force is, right? So what's the composition and how is it made and so on, and that essentially it's all about the transients. And that's was one of the things which, because we've been historically talking about this problem with the levers, right? And it has been tackled, well, obviously starting with Steve and his impossible, the impossible levers type of statements and so on. And it's always been the thing is that somehow these guys, they managed to find the escape, right? So you see, they would say that, oh, but if we really take the free body diagram and then from the free body diagram do this, so then, okay, now our levers are not so bad. And that's really what I believe is essential, is to kind of bring up the level of a conversation and zoom in and really point this out, that, like, we have to move from sort of middle school at least to high school, where we sort of, yeah, because that's a paradox. That's a paradox. It's all, geometry. What is geometry? Geometry is introduced at 5th grade. I mean, like 6th grade, and something like this. It's introduced to 10-year-olds effectively. And then the calculus with, transiences, derivatives and integrals, well, that's introduced to 15-year-olds, right? So, but then when you try to speak about it to our audiences, like, oh no, that's impossible. This is freaking impossible mathematics, and so this is supposed to be for 15-year-olds, right? And then the conversation never really moves beyond that level, right? So, but why is that? Because everybody takes on board this basic idea that, okay, these are measurements, these are geometries, this is this, but what we really want to bring in is to say, hey, it's life, and life happens in the irregular fashion, and there are transiences, but transiences are not symmetrical. So they're not symmetrical in time. And mini injury that happens at a fraction then would cost you like 1,000 times more in terms of healing, and will break your cycles, right? So you see, in that sense, the whole argument about the levers is not about their, even mechanical aspect. We move into the point is that, well, with the levers, the control is outsourced, and if, if the, like, we delegate this anywhere further, then the local tissues are vulnerable, and if they're vulnerable, they could be damaged, and that damage in the living tissues is going to really go the long way. So that's just one of the lines why this type of language is important, so that we bring the conversation from the formulas into the meaning, and yeah, Let's
And-
leave it
and-
like this.
Okay, super. That's fantastic, Leonid. And I think that's one of the great things about coming together, the four of you on this paper, is that everybody brings their own perspectives and their own strengths. I'm not sure, Steve or Susan, did you want to contribute anything? And if you do, please just unmute yourselves and open up the chat. And then I am hoping that Michelle will come up, because I saw an email from Michelle on the paper. So
I'll just say, anybody who's not looking at the chat, Snap, Crackle, and Pop is from an old Rice Krispies cereal commercial here in the United States. So I put a link so that you can see the old jingle with the three-part harmony and all of that, the syncopation. It's a lot of fun. But that's when Leonid talks about the joke that the physicists were making when they came up with naming these terms. It's clearly a Rice Krispies reference.
It's actually acknowledged that this is the Rice Krispies reference, because they do this snap, crackle, and pop. But my point is that it's one of those ironies that actually, when they try to be serious and use the methods of physics to help biology, they come up with all sorts of crap, right? And when they joke, actually they come up with something useful.
Okay, I'll let everybody know that Craig Nevin is here, and he is also making some comments in the chat. Force equals 1/time times momentum, and force is the rate of change of a momentum. And he goes on to talk about a car's road speed is the rate of change of distance, which is measured by a speedometer on the dashboard. I don't know if you want to say more about that, Craig, before I invite Michelle up.
But I think the important thing, right? I mean, if this is all seeming like it's over your head, if you've been on a train, right? You're sitting there, you're waiting for the train to start. And then the engine starts to move, and until there's a tensional line from the front of the train to the back, the train's not going to be able to move smoothly and go ahead. So in that moment, there's going to be that shaking, right? And then when the train comes to a stop, or when a car comes to a stop, right, Leonid?
Well, that's true, but you see, let me bring it the other way around, right?
I mean, they're trying to.
But let me just give you something else.
Figure out a way to express that kind of.
Yes and no. Yes and no. Okay, this is true, but this leads us in the wrong direction. Not in the wrong direction. This leads us a little bit further away, right? See, look, I was really thinking about this quite a bit lately, because there are calculus works both ways, right? It's called integral differential. So if you take a derivative, you should be able to get the integral, right? So you see, and it goes back and forth. And then if you think about it, what is essentially acceleration? What does acceleration tell you in its deep essence? In its deep essence, it actually tells you about the non-uniformity, right? So you see, like if you take the first law of Newton, so in that respect, and kind of just go beyond whatever celestial bodies and mechanics and so on, so it states that, okay, you have either, the position or the uniform motion, and then the force is something that changes things, right? This is something like a sudden change, transition, and so on. And think about the Gumberto videos. So what's happening there? You have this kind of what Steve calls a snot, right? And then you have all these links which are forming and then being broken all the time. So in other words, if you are dealing with the medium which has a built-in irregularity, so then any kind of links, as they work within it and as they crack and then reassemble, there's going to be an irregularity. It's not going to be a perfectly smooth action. There are going to be some jumps, some transiences. And that's really what the whole idea of the, jerk snaps and so on, so that it actually highlights that you've got some sudden events, sudden irregularities, especially if you've got an irregularly structured, medium, then you're going to have some sudden irregularities, and then you have to deal with them. So how do you deal with sudden irregularities? So that's really the essence of it. And but because if you don't deal with sudden irregularities, then you get a damage. And then damage costs you 1,000 times, the energy expenditure and 1,000 times the time scale to heal. So that's really the biggest point. And lately, I've actually been thinking about it in a different way, right? So you see, we still, because when we talk about traditional engineering and calculus and so on, where does it start from? It starts from position. So, and then from position, it goes into momentum. From momentum, it goes into acceleration, and then from it, and so on and so forth. But if you think about the internal kind of calculus of the organism, that should work the other way around. It should work from high to low rather than from low to high. Because what would be, if the quicker the transients, right? So the more risks it carries. So even the word snap, something snapped. How would you interpret the snap? Snap, something that suddenly gave away, right? That's a snap. And it's no longer holding together. So that's a snap. So therefore, snap, jerk, and so on. So basically, it's the other way around. Instead of kind of going from infinite static, right? So you see to that shorter and shorter, let's say transients over time. In fact, when it comes to life, it's the other way around. So, acceleration would be an integral over a snap and not the derivative of position. So, it all depends on where you count from. So, and that brings us to our bigger conversation from where everything actually started, right? So you see that, in fact, this was supposed to be the first take on the superstability paper. So, so which brings us to this same thing, that what is superstability? How do you maintain autonomy? How do you manage to handle the sudden transiences and maintain that integrity? So, which is, in fact, the whole essence of the tensegrity architecture.
Let me fill in to say that all of this and what Leon is referring to came out of a series of conversations that the four of us were having back in January of 2020, when Graham and Leonid were here in the area, staying in the area, and meeting at Steve's, and I was there for many of those meetings, not all of them. And that's when we started talking about superstability, and this came out of that. This and many other conversations. Is that just to give everybody a context?
Can I pop in as well and say that, okay, for me, superstability has been quite a hard thing to wrap my mind around. I'm still working on it. I understand from talking with Graham that that's because it's a hard subject. But
wait, but it's not. It's not.
I just want to say that Graham has a presentation up on the Embodied Biotensegrity platform.
Okay.
It's free to watch. And there was something about the way Graham presented it that made it a little bit of an aha come up for me. So that's available, and I can find it and put the link in the chat here. Okay, now
But-
you can, you can enlighten me,
But
Leonid.
look, you see, that's what I was thinking lately, right? You see, again, visualize the Gumberto videos. You
Okay.
have them in mind, yes?
Yeah.
So what's happening there, right? So you see there you have all these lines kind of, well, we will even put aside the fact that there is an additional tension introduced into it by the insertion of the endoscope and so on. In fact, paradoxically, maybe it's even for the better because it allows us to see kind of the next level of their behavior. So, but what's happening? Those things, they're kind of continuously, breaking and then reassembling. So the whole idea is that this happens in a very irregular fashion. And somehow, right, somehow that particular natural selection of whatever, of the chemical composition, physical composition, and so on, of these compounds, which eventually became fascia and so on, right, is capable of dealing with those, the suddenness of this change, suddenness of the things falling apart, and then suddenness of the things reconnecting at the micro level. So that's the suddenness, right? So you see, the whole story of superstability is how do you deal with suddenness? And suddenness, what is the whole calculus? Is about the fact that suddenness has different flavors, right? So you see, it's different levels of suddenness. So when we visualize or when we experience ourselves on a train, which is just doing a move, or when in a car, which is kind of rolling to a stop at the red light, this is an illustration of a suddenness, which is more sudden than the acceleration with, or than the movement which we had before. So that is just the whole calculus is how you deal with the suddenness back and forth. So, because, lately I also was kind of rereading the works of Archibald Hill, right? So, who is the father of muscle physiology and the author of the famous muscle force velocity equation. And he was a really smart chap. And if you think about it, his descriptions that a muscle contraction turns the muscle, compared to the resting muscle, the muscle contraction turns the muscle into a vulcanized rubber. It's such a massive change, massive change. Then, if you think about the nervous so-called signal, what is this? This is short circuitry. So effectively, it's, implosion wrapped in a short circuit. That's what a muscle contraction is. And we put this, an absolutely dramatic event, as an elementary thing for the muscle contraction. How ridiculous this could be. It's a absolutely magical thing that the muscle contracts and then returns. That it's possible to do, it's capable of doing both contraction, but then coming back to the state of relaxation, because to come back into the state of the relaxation, you have to undo. You have to undo the short circuit, and you have to undo the internal implosion. So
yeah, this is really helpful in the reframing to talking about both the suddenness of muscle contraction, but also visualizing
all of those things, you see, basically what is, classic mechanics, and that it takes the simplest case of suddenness. So what is the kind of, if you think about it, was the greatest revolution in science? The greatest revolution in science was the invention of calculus. So that, whatever, competitively or jointly, whatever, between Leibniz and Newton, they have managed to invent the measure, the ability to kind of tackle and handle suddenness, which technically is called the rate of change, let's say, of the rate of change, right? So, which is represented by acceleration. The acceleration gives you the ability to deal with force, because force is no more than a certain proportion, a constant proportionate to acceleration. So it's all about the ability to deal with suddenness and how you get suddenness, which goes forwards, and then you do kind of unsudden, right? Because a sudden could be a snap, or a sudden could be a connection. So that's the thing. And then what we are saying, in fact, what's the difference? To describe the mechanical world around us, it's enough to have a second order differential equations, which means just a single unit of, single handle, single kind of reigns of suddenness gives us civilization. And what is our basic assumption is that if you want to get to the next level, so life is able to deal with greater spectrum of the grades of suddenness. That's all it is. So that's why when you are in 5th grade, you study geometry where there is no suddenness. And then when you go to 9th grade, they introduce calculus to you, which is actually a study of suddenness.
I didn't get calculus in 9th grade. It took me a lot longer to get there, and I never really did understand it. But what I want to do here is just jump in. I see Michelle. Sorry, it took me a while to actually see that you had put your camera on and unmuted. So I'd like to invite Michelle up. We also have Bob with his camera on. Did you want to say something as well after Michelle, Bob? Okay, go ahead, Michelle.
You can hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. So happy to be with you. Thank you, Graham, for this great lecture. Really, again, new things and old things, when you say are not old, because your article is you co-signed with Leonid, Susan, and Steve, is a great happiness for me. I presented it at last Fascial Congress in France. And I think Carla Stecco has heard me, and she went to look at it, and she gave her assumption about what you say, and I'm very happy because it's a big step for these people from another board of Fascial than Tensegrity. I think they do really a step in the direction of dynamics of architecture. And for me, what is very important is what you have really put the focus on is a compartment. Cell compartment is very, very important, and it's make the continuity inside the structure, and also give the hierarchy and the dynamics of the tensegrity system in biology. And for me, it's very strong. It goes at all scales, and we really understand what an histologist in the past, Malpighi, that I presented to my student, because I was teaching histology to medical students, and I spoke about Malpighi corpuscle, and he was well known for some description of histology. And I discovered with you the big work he did about this compartment cells. It's very, very important to see that this is a key for many people to understand tensegrity with hierarchy, which begins to the small scale and goes to macro scale. So thank you so much, and you went very far in history, and you are very strongly linked inside this article, all you four, and there is no history of person. We cannot see who has written what. So it's very important. It's really a tensegrel article, no domination, and very scientific. And thank you very much for it. Thank you.
Actually, maybe I just want to say that considering what Michelle was saying is that, in fact, I think it's really important, really, to highlight this difference between the cell and the cellular tissue, right? Because it's because in reality, what we end up in a kind of post-Schwann parenchymal cells type of approach is that it's the cell that became the kind of center of our standard attention, right? And then the tissue is like, what is a tissue? Even if you look at the definition, the tissue is an aggregate of cells. So, but in fact, if you look at the original word, so which is, well, it's the tissue, it's a cellular tissue, where the tissue is the leading word, right? And the cellular is a sort of secondary one. So, because in that respect, it means that what is kind of a stronger part and what is a variable, right? So you see that, because this means that we can experience a certain change in the tissue composition in order to maintain certain essential properties, right? And then, it's a lot of it's I think it's a very fine but a very important nuance to come back to the understanding that actually, in that respect, from the architectural standpoint, is the tissue, which is a kind of bigger, right? So you see a more fundamental entity than the individual cell, because it's the tissue which defines the environment in which cells, whatever, live and die and do all those other things. So I think that that's also actually that's the thing that I really picked up as an additional exclamation and kind of highlight point from Graham's presentation, even though we did it, right? So you see, but then you sort of, it's just, it's just the thing is that after a certain while you look at it and say, yeah, that's true. So it's actually, it's a very clean thing, the cell versus the cellular tissue. So, and yeah, that's it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. Did you want to respond before we invite Bob up?
Not specifically, but as this is a tea party, perhaps we invite people to open up their videos if they wish, so we can
That's great.
suit up the party.
Good idea. And go ahead, Bob.
Thank you, everyone. Again, the more I read this, the more I hear I talk about it, I'm just more astounded by the paper. And thank you, Leonid, for the descriptions about suddenness and transience, because that's sort of suddenly making more sense to me. But I want to, I guess, add on to that or ask a question. I just wanted to quote one line from the paper, which talks about this duality. This updated perspective on anatomy now raises an important philosophical question. Where is the cart and where is the horse? What, if anything, is leading what? The ubiquitous compartmental framework or its local parenchymal cell contents? So what I was thinking when you're talking about, transience and suddenness, Leonid, I guess a difference between one, for me, this is a classic clinical decision making that I have to do in the clinic as a manual therapist. Is like when I want to treat a restriction, do I feel like the restriction is in the structure, or do I feel like the structure is responding to an aberrant physiology from the organ itself? And I might treat each, differently. Looking at it from a is and through the context of somatovisceral reflexes and viscerosomatic reflexes. So I guess the question from this duality is, do you have a sense of, maybe Graham, from a clinical perspective, which is leading most of the time? Or I guess from the hierarchical perspective, it depends on certainly what is happening at the time. Is it more movement, or is it more internal physiology in response to digestion? So I don't know if I'm framing this question accurately, but that's kind of where I'm thinking, just from a clinical perspective. It is the duality, and to me, from a treatment perspective, I would look at each maybe leading at one point in time, but that you may disagree. But that's kind of where my thought is.
That's a good question. I think the standard view of science is that this comes before this, comes before this, comes before that. We have the most important and the lesser, and yet biology just does it all in one go. Everything's related to everything else. So when we determine a sequence of events, it's interesting and useful, but it's almost at another level, it's almost meaningless as well at the same time. If you have a client patient present with a particular issue, you work through a sequence of things in your thoughts to address that person's issue. So you have almost a hierarchy, but at the same time, that's just a way of thinking, because when you get your hands on the body, you're working at everything at the same time. You just put your hand on a person. It's difficult to describe or define exactly what you're doing. And so when I present that, mention about the philosophical question, is it the compartment or the parenchymal cells within? It depends on how you think about it.
Well, I think I have a stronger opinion in that sense.
Okay.
Because again, we go back to the basic kind of calculus engine. So from that perspective, their tissue is an integral. So it's a dispersion, right? So you see, and the cell in that sense would be a particular derivative within it. So then the central question is, what kind of time budget you have? So if you have a limited time budget, you have to go through the path of the derivatives, and then you're looking for their more effective discharge, because, effectively, what is pain? What is clinical syndromes? What is kind of something which we have being captured by reflexes or sensors and all the other things? So effectively, it's a transience kind of back and forth cascade that just stalled at some point and didn't have a kind of good enough passage between the scales. So, because, if you look you see, one of the things which I find very important, right, is that, you see, paradoxically, until this day, we call, for example, the cells the microstructures. So because they belong to the micrometers, or we call their molecule, their things like ATP and so on, we call their nano level, which is really a weird thing. A weird thing, because we count from the mono level of the meters to which we belong. In fact, if we think about computationally, we should think about it the other way around. So cells are mega level and we are mono level. What is the opposite of the micro, right? Is the mega, right? What is a flip of the nano? Is a giga. So nano is 1 billionth. So giga is meaning that if something was 1 billionth in size, that means that there are billions of them. And if there are billions of them, they have no names. By definition, you can't name a billion things and try to track them. So that scale transition, effectively, we have from, if you look at the kind of tangible hierarchy, It's a tangible hierarchy from giga scale, which we have at the nanometers, all the way to the monoscale, where we can perceive it, where we exist kind of at our level of what we are able to interpret, right? So you see, and over there, things are happening in nanoseconds. In our level, it happens in seconds. Compare a nanosecond to a second. It's super slow. You know, there are a billion events that happen there at this giga level by the time, you know, things clicked for us. So in that sense, if you think about it, you realize that, you know, the body is absolutely gigantic, and it lives, you know, in a completely different time frame from where we are, right? So you see, if we think about the person, so that's also helps you to get a very simple understanding. So in fact, the multi-scale is literally multi-scale. So you got a giga-scale extracellular matrix. It's a giga-scale because it's nanometers, right? So you see, which then goes to the mega-scale, which would be cells and all the other kind of compartments of the micrometer size. And then it goes further to the kilo scale, hectare scale, and so on until it gets to the monoscale, which is, you know, a single person. So, and in fact, it's a very simple thing. What we experience clinically, we experience things at the kind of deca level. People come with the, you know, because how many muscles would be a typical person, or how many kind of clinical areas a typical practitioner would operate with? You know, think about it. Maybe you have the top 10, but, you know, your reality would be maybe top 100. If you are super, mega, ultra good, you might keep in mind top 500, but definitely not top 5 million. So, and in that sense, we have a very simple dilemma. What do we do? So do we discharge kind of, because, you know, if something is stuck on the way from the giga scale to the monoscale, either we can facilitate it and help it to get out, so which would be further derivative, more effective discharge, we help it to be a better derivative. So that's, you know, this is a discharge of the tension. This is discharge, this is a trigger point, this is whatever, and so on. But then, on the other hand, we have this biggest concept of the cellular tissue, the concept of the superstability, which means that any kind of failure, any kind of this kind, has a deeper roots at the previous level. So it means that there are deficits of the self-stabilization. So if we have bigger time budgets, then we have to consider what are the weaknesses at the previous level, so that to which the body responds at this level by what we experience as the restriction, right? Because super stability should be there. You know, it should be at the mega and giga levels. If the body is forced to do the restrictions at the level of, you know, dozens or hundreds of muscles, that means that something failed at that big giga soup. So we always have two options. If we are short on time, we help with the discharge. If we have time, we have to build a better stability behind it. So that's what we do, you know, that's an algorithm. And then, of course, within this algorithm, what is their kind of, what are the specifics of their manual profession? The specifics of the manual profession that you as a practitioner, you are capable of dealing with this kind of consecutive stack of tensions and compressions without interruptions, right? So you see, you know, like if you put your hand on the person, you don't remove it, right? You put your hand on the person, you experience a certain thing that pops back to you, then you change your position, then something comes to them, and then comes back, and then comes back. And so it's this sequence of back and forth. That's effectively, you are stacking up those suddennesses, and that opens, you know, this is like every time you do this back and forth, that unlocks the new door, unlocks the new door, unlocks the new door, unlocks the new door, and you get the access to something which otherwise would not be accessible without those previous 10 steps of the tension compression transitions that you needed to do. So that's the magic of the manual. That's the magic and kind of irreplaceability of the manual skill, because there is no machine that is able ever to do this stacking. But conceptually, it's very straightforward. Either we go towards, anything we experience as this musculoskeletal or fascial, whatever systems, it's something which is stuck on the way, either on the way towards there or on the way back. So either converging to monoscale with which we perform in the external environment, or diverging back at the gigascale where our bodies actually live. So, and then you just define. So you see, basically, manually, you can help that transition towards the monoscale, but if you have time, you feed the base. That's actually it. So, and that's the difference between the formula and between the manual thing.
Okay. Thank you. That's helpful.
Great question, Bob. Thank you, Leonid. And George, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come on up?
Sure. I'm just curious, Leonid, what is your background? I've heard you speak before. Is it physics? Is it math?
I used to, when I got out of school, I studied cybernetics.
Okay, all right.
And then I moved to the manual therapy, physical therapy, to the manual therapy and rehabilitation because of the family. So my father was, he's retired now, but he's been a professor of physical rehabilitation. So I first started with cybernetics, and then I returned to the family path.
Understood.
But with some transitions.
All right. Just had a couple of thoughts I wanted to share, because I used to teach human dissection for a number of years, and one of the experiences there was, comparing, the mechanistic properties of tissue compared to a living subject. And I think one of the pieces that I would love us to consider is that this is not simply a mechanistic framework that we're talking about, whether it's in a cellular cytoskeleton, the extracellular matrix. This is governed by many, many other systems, physiological properties, neurological systems, electrical, bioelectric influences on tissue. So for example, my hand is very floppy here, and it has this very soft, tone. But if I have a thought and I create rigidity and I support that through a thought, I can instantly change the properties of that tissue. And, I studied martial arts, and basically, this becomes a weapon. You can break bricks and wood with this hand, as opposed to a piece of wood hitting your hand, and breaks the bones in your hand. So to me, I think we should really be considering the bioelectric and physiological properties and how this can literally change at a quantum level when we have a thought, when we have a neurological influence, physiological changes at the cellular level, even things like the effects of infrared light on tissue, on the mitochondria, on the physiology. All of that has an influence. And I think, when you consider the human frame or the human body mechanistically at a cellular or extracellular tissue level, I think we have to recognize that there are so many layers of influence here, and we have to consider all of those properties. And so, from my experience, an injury to the head or the spine, which can affect the nerve supply to its distribution from those centers, has radical influences on tissue properties. You get things like hypertonicity, after a stroke, for example, on one side of the body versus the other. You lose tone because of a nerve root impingement. So really, bringing into this, bringing more layers of understanding of how these tissues are reacting beyond the mechanistic approach, looking at it from a bioelectric, and intentional perspective, how stress affects people, those things, changing muscle tension, all of those things have to be considered. I'm sure many of you do, but I feel like we kind of get lost in the weeds sometimes if we're strictly looking at the mechanistic side of the body. The living body is not the same as just a collection of tissues and cells. So that's the only thing I wanted to add to the conversation. That's my point. Okay.
Well, you see, I mean, actually, I would flip the argument. All right. So you see, the way I look at it is that, in fact, the central nervous system is a problem. You see, think about it. So what is a central nervous system? The central nervous system is an interface that we need to deal with the external world at the mono level. Because you see, otherwise, because look, my main specialty are severe brain injuries, right? So you see, I make a living from working in the rehabilitation field. I'm basically teaching the home programs to the parents of the children who are level 4 and level 5 affected, right? So you see, meaning the ones who are non-verbal, non-whatever, non-anything, so barely alive, right? So, and what you have in those children, the main challenge for them is that they don't have the separation of tone, right? So you see, you think about it. The fact is, the brain is the least effective thing for dealing with anything related to movement, because you have the same electrical format which is picking up the interferences and obstacles from all other tones. You see, the very fact that you have the muscle tone which depends on the electrical signals is a problem. So because if you look at the child, and who doesn't have this independences, for whom there, he thinks about something, he goes like this, right? So you see, there's a thought, there is a feeling, there is this. So the tone is a problem. So, and if you think about it the other way, where does the signal end? It's the motor unit. And the motor unit, where does it end? Let's say the signal terminates, and there are still at least 2,000 fibers which are going further down. So, the nervous system is a later addition which we need to deal with the external world. But the way that it impacts that giga levels, there must be some self-organizations there.
So you're talking about severe brain injury, which they've lost the regulatory function, correct? That's what you're
But you see, my question is that where does the regulatory function come? And the thing is that you see,
it's not the brain, it's not the nervous system.
My point is that you see, the way that I would look at it like this, you see, if you get it in this. So you see, basically, in utero, you develop their anatomical intelligence. So you develop the 3D maps, which kind of, especially nowadays, it's more or less easier to explain. So you see, you can explain them as more or less this systems of deep learning infrastructure, right? So you see, like all this so-called artificial intelligence, it comes from the idea of the deep learning networks, which in order to work, they have to be extremely deep. They are fundamentally dumb, but they're extremely deep. And by going through cycles and cycles and cycles, they become smart. So in that sense, it's the very fact that we have the giga levels, which gives this deep learning architecture, and the deep learning architecture itself, which is built into this 3D mapping. And what happens? This 3D architecture is of course, it's linked, right? So it's a cascade. So where, as a knot, it has, let's say, billions and billions of previous, let's say, levels, they converge on a compact encryption, which becomes a unit of their, which becomes a unit of the central nervous system. But you see, my point is that, you see, the body deals with different modalities. It deals with whatever, electromagnetic, it deals with physical, it deals with chemical, deals with mechanics, and so on and so on. The very fact that central nervous system runs on a single electrical format, it's a problem.
Sorry,
So it's an
I'm going to have to jump in here because I'm already late, and I want to just say thanks to everybody for being here. I have to dash, and I am very pleased to introduce everyone to Kamila Moravkova. Excuse the pronunciation, Kamila. I'm doing my best. She's a really strong member of our community. Kamila is a member of the physio group that teaches the applied biotensegrity and physiotherapy, and she's going to take over as our facilitator today. Camilla, I hope there's a question from Robert in the chat as well. Okay, I've got a dash. Thanks. Sorry for interrupting you there, but I will see you guys next week. Looking forward to next week's session as well. Ciao.
I think you did very well with the Slavic accent, yeah? So, Camila, I think you wouldn't mind, right? So that was a good one from...
Was very good for
So anyway, so if we get back to this, right? So my point is this, is that in that sense, when we get to the deeper levels, to this kind of giga levels of all this distributed stuff, so it goes into the levels of the encryption. And in fact, what happens with the brain injury, I would consider it as a kind of two-way thing. On the one hand, you lose their specific 3D organization of those giga levels. They become basically a soup, you know, a statistical collagenous soup, instead of being highly differentiated 3D architecture, which has a built-in anatomical intelligence. And as a result, on the other hand, because of these interruptions and so on and so forth, the brain loses the ability to link. It loses the kind of encryption codes or decoding capacity towards the giga levels. And then what you have there, the brain has to try to solve everything using traditional anatomy. So you see, effectively, a child with a cerebral palsy is the one who is using the brain according to the textbook. He's using the muscles according to the textbook, you know, from end to end, the full muscle. He's using everything according to the textbook and just fails. Because my even bigger point is this. If something has a name, it's wrong. You know, we cannot figure anything out about life if we try to navigate structures with names. It's too shallow. Anatomy, how many names are there? 2,000? 3,000? For a human mind, it's huge. For the attempt to understand life, it's infinitely small. So my big understanding is this: anatomy has to be anonymized, statistical, like statistical mechanics in that sense. So, and only by going statistical to the anonymous kind of soup of life that is within us, we can expect to figure something out. And definitely, you know, central nervous system is essential as an interface with the external world, which comes at the monolevel. But central nervous system ends quite early. It terminates too early to be able to regulate the deeper things. So that's what I kind of see also as a current level. Yeah.
Sure. I just want to add another perspective here. You know, just my experience, and I did present a few years ago the bone changes that we see in the cranium, for example, and literally something I've been talking about for almost 35 or longer, 35 years. And that is when you have an injury, it changes bone structure. However, in the cranium, you know, barring cerebral palsy, which is, you know, an anoxic injury, which is a significant deficit that a child is born with, that's a very different scenario. Someone who suffers an acquired brain injury or head injury, we have experience in our clinical experience. We can literally restore muscle symmetry, muscle tone, almost within minutes by restoring integrity to the cranial structure, by removing stress to the central nervous system. So And this is something which I've been talking about for a long time. And just recently from Monash University, I'll send the link. They actually identified that. They verified that there are significant correlations between cranial bone changes and traumatic brain injury. And so something that, I've taught this for many years, by restoring the structure pre-injury, you can restore neurological connections with the body almost instantaneously, normalizing Babinski response, normalizing muscle tone. So when you say the central nervous system is really down the list, to me, that's where consciousness interfaces with the human body. The brain is, in my opinion, a receiver of consciousness. And then if you want to go beyond that, you can say, where is life coming from? The body is not life. The body is a vehicle for life, okay? Our job as clinicians is to find out what's interfering with that interface. That interface can happen at the physical level, the chemical level, the spiritual level, the emotional level. And when you downplay the idea of the nervous system, to me, it's like, I think you're just looking at a specific population of severely brain injured or neurologically compromised individuals where you're not going to necessarily have any potential for restoration. And in a general well population with minor traumatic brain injury, I would say, mild traumatic brain injury, it's definitely possible to restore that. We do it all the time in our practice and with our students. So I would invite you to look
No,
at.
actually, you see, I would probably reformulate what I want to say, right? In fact, I'm more of an admirer of the central nervous system, right? I'm just pointing out, my whole point is that the thing is that the central nervous system gets dragged into where it shouldn't. So in fact, what you are mentioning in terms of, cranial transitions and so on, and the ability to reframe and heal their fresh injury. So the way that I would see it is that it's more your ability to deal with a different scale rather than, and then the central nervous system adapts to this very happily. So, and then the conversation, which kind of goes further, who we are and what is their, the level of, the consciousness and beyond consciousness and so on. I mean, this is, it's a different story altogether, right? But my point is this, is that if we are using physics, if we are using kind of basic language, so my point is actually this, is that like we have to, instead of dividing, this is central nervous system, which is responsible for the computation and which kind of is an external controller, I'm actually standing on a very simple position that there is an built-in anatomical intelligence all the way from their anonymous levels, and then that this kind of self-regulating anonymous intelligence is what runs the whole thing a lot more than the central nervous system. That's it.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll leave it. I just want to say that to me, everything is biotensegrity, including nervous tissue, including the cytoskeleton, all of that. To me, this idea of compartmentalism is there may be a limitation to that concept. I think we have to look at things more holistically, and I think most of you recognize that. And I just think that it's something that I just find more and more we have to begin to integrate, all these systems as as a continuous fabric through the body, but it's also bioelectric, photonic, consciousness, and biochemical in nature. And the body is capable of restoring itself dramatically. We see people recovering from serious illness through consciousness. I don't know if any of you have listened to Ibn Alexander. Has anyone heard of Ibn Alexander? Okay. So he was a person who had a near-death experience. His brain was essentially liquefied through a significant infection. And he was dead for, I forget how many hours. And he had an experience that he came back and talks about. He's a neuroscientist, a neurosurgeon, actually. And, it defies our ability to comprehend how someone can recover from essentially almost a complete liquefaction of the gray matter of his brain. and then coming back with absolute total health, integrity, intellectual and cognitive function, to the point where he lectures around the world about his experiences and things that you could not explain otherwise. So I really feel like, there's more to the story. We have to move beyond the mechanistic concept here. Although I appreciate the mechanistic side of things, I think we're really, yeah. Anyways, I would like to see the conversation expand beyond that. The math and physics is wonderful, but it has limitations. All right, so that's all I wanted to say. I will leave it at that.
But look, George, maybe just to kind of stay on the right path, right? So you see there are two levels here, well, even three. So level one was that you need to get certain upgrade over the current mechanistic perceptions, okay? So that's basically any goal of the publication is to possibly get an upgrade within their sort of within the type of the language and the format and so on that is considered to be scientific. So that was very much their first level of the paper, right? So the second thing is that whatever we talk about, we are also, even if we move into whatever higher spiritual and other domains, we're still very much, I don't know whether we should say contaminated or affected and so on by even the language and the vocabulary that we have. It carries a certain level of the mechanistic and the other, kind of influences and references, which we throw around without really kind of reflecting on them or recognizing them. And that's why I think that it makes sense to upgrade the mechanistic level. So it gives us more freedoms further up. That's
Very
it.
good. All right, I put the paper on cranial bone changes
Thank
induced
you.
from traumatic brain injury, and the name of the neurosurgeon who I mentioned earlier as well. All right, thanks, Leonid. Thanks for clarifying that.
Thank you, George, for this and for your exchange. It's very interesting for me to see. I think it's important who works with which patients. And as a physiotherapist, I was taught to focus a lot on things from the perspective of the certain central nervous system. And the mechanistic part is very important right now for me. But I'm like all about the holism, George, and I think it's very important you share that. I miss Yap being here, to be honest. I would like his input on this. But let's move on. I see Robert has put something in the chat, and if I may ask you, Robert, would you like to share your comments to this?
Hello, hi.
Hello, welcome.
Hi, how are you? I just have a question that I was thinking that I put there. How the suprastability in that integrity structure contributes to the resilience and, I guess, self-stabilization of the whole system under varying external loads. And I think that we should also consider, I put, what mathematical condition define the suprastable tensegrity system. I think this is a great concept. I intuitively hope to understand it. But I also think that it's important that we define certain terms and not to kind of go off. Everything is interconnected, but otherwise it will be too difficult to grasp the concept. So I don't know if somebody can talk
Thank you.
about definition, like the concept. And if I may, maybe stupidly, forgive me, I am thinking of suprastability especially in tensegrity structure as a state where system remains stable under external forces, and because it has inherent redundancy in a force distribution and stiffness. So this is the critical that the system can maintain in its shape and function without relying on excessive material usage or any other stuff. So that's how I'm thinking about suprastability. Is this too naive, stupid? I don't know, we all are learning here.
Well, first of all, the concept of superstability comes from Robert Connolly. So that's their person who has done the most advances in the mathematics of tensegrity. So, and his basic statement was that, unfortunately, there is no ready-made mathematics for the stability of the framework where the framework is defined by any, as any sort of interconnected network of, whatever, any type of size and so on, but sort of self-contained in that sense, right? So you see, that was his whole point. And he defines the tensegrity for that kind of looking for the general theorems, right? So you see, he defines it at the level of the most abstract definition. So instead of talking about the struts and T, Graham, what is this? The struts and cables, yes. Instead of the struts and cables, he talks about the two. It's basically, he puts it in the format of the most general inequalities. So where the struts is the equivalent of their how close the things can come, and the cable is their equivalent of the limit of how far the elements could come from each other. So that's his definition, and then from there he works out this basic superstability theorem, which indicates that it's the tensegrity architecture that allows that framework to withstand their effectively first and second, to withstand their second derivatives, right? So it's to withstand their shocks to the system. So basically that's it. So in fact, we come back to this as a definition that superstability is just, if it's kind of an upgrade of the idea of this, the word super, I believe, being added to express that instead of it's not only capable of sort of self-stabilization under, let's say, static conditions, but it's able to withstand an sudden impact, which then distributes through the entire architecture and kind of gets anonymized spread because it doesn't create any force concentration. So that's what I understand as the superstability theorem that comes from the most abstract form. But at the same time, I must say that whenever, we made an attempt of having a conversation with Professor Connolly, and he's been mega anti-enthusiastic about any use of his stuff for biology. Like, I am just a theoretical mathematician. I have nothing to do with this. Don't drag me into that. I love the tensegrity models, but I just do this kind of rigorous mathematical science, and I have the reputation, and don't drag it anywhere else. So
I understand.
So, and considering the fact that he's almost 80, that he has, kind of a room at Cornell, which is full of tensegrity models, and that, he is a professor emeritus who is kind of entitled for entertaining thoughts. When the moment you say something about biology, it's like, start mentioning Satan in a church. It's basically, he just starts putting crosses and everything around him, and just like, don't even come close to me, for any applied meaning of this. So that's really what we have to understand. So therefore, dragging it in has been our own liberty. So because it gives I believe that it's works instead of just relying on Fuller, who's been coming from he's from a different school of mathematical kind of interpretation altogether. So that's why I believe that, especially since we move towards the transiences and calculus and so, the calculus and so on and so on. So I believe that in that respect, the concept of the superstability is very essential, because it gives, basically, the way I see it, it's the formulation of the autonomy for any physical system. So if the system has a mechanical embodiment, so the key question, what kind of internal architecture maintains its autonomy, its difference, kind of a computational barrier from the surrounding environment. And in that sense, I think that that's where taking this most abstract thing, that it basically has this internal structure, which is kind of based on just a duality of this struts and cables as the basic inequalities, so that it's capable, that it's enough to formulate this autonomy. I think it's a very powerful thing, because it actually works through anonymizing it rather than putting the specific things. And for me, I think that the most amazing thing about integrity is that, as conceptually, it's something that could be streamlined from this complete, that it has the capacity to travel into more and more and more and more kind of physical embodiment, all the way from this kind of most abstract definition, which is effectively a balance of two inequalities, all the way to the kind of tensegrity tetrahedron, which is apparently a countable number of the struts and cables, and through this maintain the same kind of internal properties and maintain the same capacity for this, maintaining their autonomy, of the internal balance of forces, right? So you see, from the external type of the suddennesses.
Well, I thank you. I again, I just trying to understand some of these things, because we all face different patients and some theoretical background. So I understand tensegrity structure with suprastability. I basically think of it as the structure that has exhibits superior load redistribution properties, meaning that when it's subjected to external forces, the system will dynamically adjust to internal forces within the cables and struts to maintain overall integrity. That's how
absolutely. But the thing is, what the whole point, right, is that you don't need their cables and struts.
I understand. These are
so, and that's
just
why, you see,
helpers
for example, you see, just, look, you're absolutely right. We're all learning here, right? So you see, we're all kind of, and for me, the way that I see it, right, is that, you see, I've been very much influenced by the Gumberto, visualizations, because, the other thing that I find very essential is the study of cracks, right? So you see, and for me, actually, it looks the other way around, right? So you see, where engineering is about kind of being as much anti-life as possible. So it's an ultimate kind of anti-life prosthetic science, if you wish, right? So you see, like, because it's trying to do the timeless thing, okay? So and that's why it's based on permanence. But what you see, if you look, and which is so kind of well visualized by Gumberto, is that this is continuous process of crack formation. But that formation of cracks is timed, right? So you see, it's effectively, it's not instant, and it's kind of overlapped with another and another and another and another. So you see, in that sense, I kind of see the organisms that instead of looking for permanences, we have to look for their opposite. So instead of the connections, it's based on their transit disconnections, which are kind of, put into a certain, which are making the clock effectively, right? So because, it's like zippers. If the two sides of my jacket are connected by a zipper. So what is a zipper? It's a crack, right? So you see, but the fact is that this crack connects and disconnects. You see, now it just doesn't want to crack, right? So you see, it's a zipper, and then, like if you look at this zipper, the Gumberto things, they're looking exactly like that. So, but in that respect, everything has if there is a kind of duality of connection and crack formation, that's enough to follow with the tensegrity architecture. And then, interestingly enough, there is a special science of cracks, which is called peridynamics. So which is about 20 years old. And there are lots of interesting things there in terms of the formulations, which are coming from the peridynamics. So that's they even label themselves as a science of cracks. So, and I think that, I always advise everybody so that's, to understand the dynamics. So it's very helpful. So that's why on the practical level, I think that's just comes to this thing, is that what do we do, right? So you see, like, basically, if superstability gives us this image, of the anonymized multi-scale network, so the logic is, if we are dealing with a finite number of elements, so the question is how we can plug ourselves into this kind of anonymized type of things, which we know as whatever, extracellular matrix and all that stuff, right? So the more we plug it in, the less force concentrations we have, which are creating clinical problems. So that's kind of a relatively simple equation that I see.
Okay, thank you.
So, yeah, basically from concentrations to maximum distributions. Whatever helps the distribution. So you see, the language that you used, I would be perfectly happy with your language as well.
Yeah, I just think about it as a redistribution property, so to speak. So just trying to understand and grasp the concept, that's all. But thank you so much. That makes sense.
I have just one short question to Robert, and that is, how did you get attracted to biotensegrity? What is happening in your clinical practice and in surgery that you see that makes you curious about some new idea, how to explain it?
Well, as you know, I am orthopedic spine surgeon, but I also spend half of almost my 20 years in tissue engineering and trying to build a scaffold and all kind of stuff. And I probably went through similar as Dr. Levin, that biomechanically a lot of things that, like, half of my colleagues believe the spine, for example, is the column that needs to be reinforced with screws, and that's what we do. And believe it or not, I had a few years back this very interesting conversation with Dr. Gracovetsky, who I contacted and started talking, and I didn't know actually who is he, and just from the few papers. And he asked me simple question, Robert, what do you do for a living? And I said, I am returning patient spine function back after they've been injured or having stuff. And he said, that's very interesting. What is normal function of spine? And I said, well, I don't think we can agree. And then he answered, well, don't you think you need to understand how it works before you try to fix it? And that kind of started a lot of these controversies, very similar what Dr. Levin described, whether it's that experiment with a knee and discs and all kind of stuff. So we start looking for new things. And also I do have a PhD in biophysics, but there's also not a whole lot of things that we can apply to body. So I read basically Dr. Graham, all the books, all the articles, but I think that I intuitively understand how that will apply, and it's a better model to explain what we see, or at least I do at least 3 times a week. Open patients, I see inside how the machine, and I am forced to put it together, although I will now agree that traditional mechanics might not apply. So I try to understand the principles so we can design this, what I call bio-inspired treatment plans, diagnosis, to understand what's going on so we can explain it to ourselves, because it will affect our thinking. We all has been taught that there is a skeleton which has rubber bands spreading across the joints, which will then bend and contract, and then we have a cover. Like spine surgeons, especially orthopods, don't care about soft tissues. We cut through and we go to the bones and then put screws. So I think that's one of the problem with surgery, and the outcomes are not great. And but we have very limited knowledge, but we are forced every day to do something, because I cannot tell the patient, we figure out in 20 years. And I make irreversible decisions. If I say we can open this patient, I might have actually harmed them. So I am now kind of student of it. I love the concept of like muscles as a hydrostats. And of course, I understand that struts and cables are somewhat abstract to helping us to understand forces. It's not as simple. It's still a reduction, but I still think that would be beneficial if we start defining these concepts. And I can feel like when we start talking about mathematics and key concept and algebra in integrals, many people like, right? It goes over, and it's of course biology on top of it. But I think this is human body's smartest engine. We just don't understand it very well.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you for coming. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Carol, I don't want to lose you. I hope you can still come with your comment. I was just not sure if it's connected with with the topic.
It is, but I'm not sure, because I have to work so hard to keep up with the math that Leonid's talking about, but I know there's always a gem in there, and I just have to keep on working hard at it. But where I have been pondering the last few days, weeks, is Susan's wonderful presentation in Brazil last week on the mistakes that people make when they're talking about biotensegrity. They're naive mistakes. They think they understand it. And she explained 5 different ways that biotensegrity science, as it's being developed, really has a depth of information that is available, and that people need to stay with it to really grasp it. And one of the common misconceptions is that the bones are the compression element, and the soft tissue is the tension element, and it's simplistic like that at that macro level, not really comprehending the micro, the cellular level. And so I wrote to her and I said, this is wonderful. It seems to me that you but you focused on structure. And everybody here who's ever heard me talk knows that I look at structure as a threshold. It's a threshold to get to function. And I want to get through that threshold as quickly as possible, as accurately as possible, but as quickly as possible. And so I said, well, talk to me about function. And she wrote back on Sutra. Well, basically what I interpreted, and I might be wrong here, what I heard her say, and I've been pondering this, the function is in the structure, Carol. The function is in the structure. And so I went to Ingber, and I asked the question, what did Ingber say? about the function of tensegrity in the body. And what I got was that tensegrity allows the body to adapt to forces and stresses in a way that traditional rigid frameworks do not. And what I got from Leonid was mathematical calculation about that adaptation. Especially, I liked his ideas of staying with it long enough that the tissue can get through the different levels of what I would call restriction energetically to function, to be able to lift up out of the place where it is. Specifically, he argued that the cytoskeleton, the internal structure of cells, behaves like a tensegrity structure. Now he's getting down to micro, providing mechanical support, which is what we've been talking about here mostly, but also enabling cells to respond dynamically to external forces. This ability to respond to mechanical stress is crucial for cellular function, such as signaling, growth, and even movement. And that to me is really what Ingvar's trying to say, that this structure, this push-pull that allows for the volume from the micro all the way out to the cosmos is really enabling responsiveness to forces in a very dynamic way. And to me, of course, the most dynamic response in my work as a Barnes myofascial release therapist, a manual therapist, is with the crystalline water rich extracellular matrix, a semiconductive network, so that I'm influencing electron and proton flow, photon flow throughout the system as a stress in the system that then the fascia can respond to in a healing way, coming back into dynamic balance. So that's in sum basically what I got out of working hard today to try to I didn't get the math too much, but I'm always rewarded by sticking with it. And when I'm wrong, I'm always so glad when people will say, well, I don't think you got that right, Carol. I mean, you skipped over that a little too much. Or you're looking at that a little bit differently than I do. And that's what I think the value of all of us is. So thanks for letting me speak up.
Thank you, Carol. Leonid, do you have any comment to this?
Well, I guess I would, but we're already kind of at the 2-hour mark, right? So
I mean,
yeah,
I'm
but
thinking like 3 more
you
minutes.
see, I'm just trying to, it kind of comes back to this, right? You see, when it comes to math, there is the sort of the formal one, right? And then the one which makes its way into the language and into the way that we think. And it's just that formal one, it's also very, very much, like what we talked about, the anatomical zoo. If you think about mathematics, that's even more of a zoo, because there everybody give their theorem, well, at least the theorems and so on, everything has been given their own name, but sometimes it's kind of, so it's even more difficult to navigate this landscape. But I believe that what we're trying to do is actually to find that language that is going to, sort of reconcile the two, because see, we don't, a lot of mathematics have been defined by this kind of primary need and the primary quest for rigor, right? So you see, because if you don't do the rigor, you are not a mathematician, and so on and so forth, right? And that's why, for example, people like Connolly, so they would be shying away from us so much, because, well, whatever we are trying to offer is not rigorous by the standards of mathematics, right? And in mathematics, everything has to be so logically tight, right? So you see that you get every single step without, like, just that there's no, like, the logic is so, it's like a crystal of logic, right? So that's what mathematics is a crystallized logic. So, but we need that crystal shifted a bit, right? So you see, we need to plant this crystal into a more wet type of reality, right? And allow this.
They call it wiggle room.
And yeah, and get this crystal to start shaping how we interpret our sort of tangible interactions. Because you see, you know, if we put the theories aside, right? You know, at the end of the day, one would be what is the essential thing, that when you are in contact with another human body, so you see, this is where, because this way you have the access to kind of this back and forth type of their computations, and that's something which goes absolutely beyond any type of, say, controlled laboratory experiment with all the constraints and limitations and kind of data, you know, data cancellations, if you wish, right? So, but what I believe is that just trying to find the essence, that's really the tricky point, right? Is that because, you know, with calculus, you have techniques, right? And there are people who are able to solve the equations at school without understanding what is it about, right? And then, you know, there is this calculus as a kind of formal thing, and then it has representation through the laws of physics and so on and so forth. But you're just trying, you know, I really spent most of the time on going through these things like, okay, the philosophy of calculus and this and this, and what is the history of science and the bibliography and this, and just trying to understand where this whole thing is coming from, what kind of, you know, what is the essence, what you're really looking for in these terms. And that's really the point, is that what we are missing is very much that factor, that we are, that our language is just too contaminated by geometry and, you know, the fixed things and so on and so forth, and then we're trying to compensate for what otherwise we could have gone through a more kind of capable, in that sense, dynamic language, right? So you see, the language of dynamics. So calculus is the language of dynamics. So how would you defer the structure if you don't have the calculus? So you see, and that's where you get this kind of idea of how it goes back and forth from smaller scales to you know, large scale, small scale, you know, more suddenness, less suddenness, this type of things. But on the other hand, you know, we have this new stuff, so which again comes in the weird labels like artificial intelligence and so on, which is kind of probably not, but it gives you a different way of understanding the learning. So, I mean, I'm just trying to find not even the balance, and trying to find a way how that we can kind of connect to what we experience, right? Basically, that's what it is. So, because the ultimate truth is in what you experience. When you get that right connection with another human body, that should be considered as the ultimate truth. And the language that we have for that is terrible. So what we need to try to do is actually to rectify the language to be able to reflect on this ultimate truth. Because otherwise, you know, within the current language, it just sees it as a, like, you know, what, weak, subjective, semi-irrelevant type of the fluke experiences, right? So, yeah, that's
Leonid
basically.
Maywan Ho says to go to Keats. an ode to a Grecian urn. That truth is beauty, beauty, truth. That is all ye know and all ye ever need to know. And she said, that's the beauty of mathematics. And when a mathematical formula comes up on the board and people recognize this is it, the descriptions that they use are descriptions from art and from nature.
Yeah, but that's that's this crystal stuff. Yeah, I mean, like, we are not looking for crystal stuff. We are looking for something more alive, So you see, with some allowances on the one hand, but at the same
What's
time,
more alive than nature?
that is not, that is a very, well, again, that's the same thing. You see, that now you're using the artistic expression, right? So, but, well, you see, that's a difficult
I love
terrain
it.
to.
He's speechless.
No, I mean, it's a difficult terrain to navigate, right? So you see, because the concept of math and let's say kind of mathematize the beauty, and that is in the other way around, that the in any kind of perfect formula there is art and beauty. So it's a different story, right? I'm just kind of trying to see what we can do with our level, with the unique set of experiences and allowances that we get through our particular times, Well, I guess that will be it for today. So we need something to ponder and digest.
Yeah, we are shortly past
How are you?
2 hours.
No spinach feta croissants left.
Oh, Jason
Yeah.
has a croissant there, I think. So, any questions and comments until we give the final toast? Okay, then. Thank you, everyone, for a great discussion. I would like to ask Graham to give us the toast because he gave us this beautiful presentation.
All right. Yes, well, thank you for being here. I'm really pleased. The whole point of writing these papers is that it sparks conversation and discussion, which it clearly has done. So cheers to all.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Let me just say thank you to the archive for making this happen. And also just point out there is a link for Susan's presentation in the chat. Very much recommended.
And thank you, Camilla, for jumping in to co-host.
Mhm.